Egypt has about 100 million people in it. The country just to the west, Libya, with almost twice the land area, has only 6 million people. What is the obvious difference between Libya and Egypt? Well, Egypt, of course, is the gift of the Nile. 95% of the 100 million people who live in Egypt live on only 3% of the land. This is an awesome statistic. That 3% of the land is the Nile River Valley and the Nile Delta. The Nile River Valley and the Nile Delta provide for incredible fertility in what is otherwise an awesomely stark desert. This is the Nile River Valley, and here is the Nile Delta, where the Nile empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Take a look at this photograph. You can see in the foreground the lush landscape of the Nile River Valley, all agricultural land. At the same time, take a look in the background. That is what most of Egypt looks like. Incredibly stark desert. The Nile is what we call an exotic river. An exotic river is a perennial river that flows through a desert. Perennial river means it flows year-round. There's never a moment that it stops flowing, so it never goes dry. Exotic rivers have as their commonality that they all begin in some other much wetter landscape. Do you remember the Indus River in Pakistan? The Indus River is also an exotic river. It begins up in the Himalaya mountains. The Tigris and Euphrates, those are exotic rivers also. They begin up in the plateau of Turkey. The Nile is an exotic river, but instead of beginning up in the mountains, it begins in Central Africa. Central Africa is part of the tropical zone. This area receives lots of precipitation for about half the year. In fact, that precipitation provides for the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, which is in the Congo. The four major rivers of Africa, the Zambezi, the Congo, the Niger, and the Nile, drain all of that tropical precipitation. Every year what would happen is rain would fall, and then water would flow northward through the Nile in a gigantic bulge that of course would become a flood. In many ways, that gigantic bulge of water helped support the ancient civilizations that we're all aware of with the pharaohs and the pyramids that arose in Egypt. The reason is because of this. After the flooding, the Nile would leave behind silt, which is dark, nutrient-rich soil. That meant that every year, the ancient people could crank their agricultural system up in the desert, basically burn the soil out and count on the gods bringing them brand new soil the following year. What that resulted in was massive food surplus. And throughout human history, when ancient societies began to have massive food surpluses, they began to turn their attention to other things. I don't believe any civilization from the ancient world turned their attention to other things like the ancient Egyptians, who built all of that fantastic stuff that we find throughout the Nile River Valley and the Nile Delta. In order to do this, they had to practice intensive agriculture, something we've met many times. Lots of human beings working on the land, producing lots of food. They practice in particular two types of intensive agriculture, multiple cropping and intercropping, both of which are still practiced in Egypt today by the majority of people who are farmers, which accounts for about half the population. This is my own backyard. That's intercropping. If you look carefully, you can see that there's a pepper plant off to the bottom right. You can see there's beet plants in the background. You can see there's carrots and onions mixed together, and an old 3-year-old eggplant that still manages to hang on. This is one day of me harvesting my own backyard. This is what intercropping is about. It's about growing more than one crop on the land at a time. By doing this, you get a variety of nutrition. This is in Egypt. If you take a look in the background, it's a little difficult to see, but if you take a look in the background, you can see that there's corn growing. Most places on earth, when you grow corn, you just grow rows of corn, and then there's a dip between each row where the water goes. What I noticed in Egypt was this: they practiced incredibly intensive agriculture there. Those light colored green things between the corn plants are cabbages. So they were growing cabbages in between the corn. And what you can't see there, but what was happening is they would put a pole bean seed. There's two types of beans: bush beans, which grows like a bush, and pole beans, which grow up a pole. They would plant pole bean seeds next to the corn, and then the pole beans would grow up in a vine like Jack and the Beanstalk up along the corn stalks, and they would be harvesting both corn and beans off of the corn stalk. So where most people would get one crop on that part of the land, they were getting three: corn, beans, and cabbages. In the foreground, you could see also potatoes off to the left and then some herbs growing. The Nile is indeed the lifeblood of that country because it not only supports the agriculture, this is where people get their water, this is where people get their cooking water, this is where they wash themselves, and this is where people wash their pots and pans and their clothing.